afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Reading and Writing Poetry in Adult Education. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Today's webinar is generously sponsored by Brainchild, and today we have Andy Montoya, who's going to share a couple words with us. Andy?
Thank you, everybody. My name is Andy Montoya, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to sponsor this event. I'm the Manager Director of Brainchild, and as an educational software company, we have come to appreciate the value and the power of the arts in the formation of responsible people. People that contribute to a more equitable society, people that do well for themselves and for their families. And in all, we are happy to be part of this initiative. Over the years, we have noticed that most of the tests and curricula developed around the English language are more on the methodical side, more than inspiring. The arts part of the language arts is not often the emphasis. And we see this as a missed opportunity because arts, poetry, enjoyable books can all be part of a major step in awakening appreciation and joy for English and literature. As a English as a second language speaker, I'm kind of appreciate English in a different way after I started reading more and more. So reading and writing poetry can be a way of expressing their feelings, stimulate the healing, and a way to relax and open their minds to support growth as adults. It is also another way for them to be heard when they express themselves this way. As Brainchild, we are happy to offer solutions that are tailor-made for adults. But here today, we are here to listen to you and to see how can we improve and include more of this poetry, more of this arts into the formation of the adult learner. Thank you for listening to me today. Thank you for your time, and please visit us at brainchild.com.
Andy, it sounds like you're the perfect sponsor for today's webinar. I love everything that you said. Couldn't agree more. So thank you very much for sponsoring this webinar. It wouldn't be possible for us to put these on and make these available to our members without sponsorships like yours. So thank you very much. Okay, so our presenter today is Carrie Colladay Stell. She received her bachelor's in social studies and education from St. Olaf College in Minnesota and taught 8th grade U.S. history for 7 years in New Jersey. She then homeschooled her 3 children from kindergarten through 12th grade. For the past 13 years, Carrie has been teaching in adult basic and secondary education classrooms for Grayson College, adult education and literacy in Denison, Texas. And she has presented at conferences for COABE, Pro Literacy, Literacy Texas, and Texas Association for Literacy and Adult Education. And it's my pleasure to introduce her today. If you want to say hello, tell her where you're calling in from today in the chat box. If you have any questions during her presentation, feel free to submit those in the Q&A box. And with that, I'll turn it over to Carrie. Thank you very much.
Okay, I trust my screen is being shared right now, James.
Yep, perfect.
Excellent. Well, first off, thank you, James. Thank you to COABE for bringing us together. And oh my goodness, I want to say amen to everything that Andy from Brainchild said. So thank you all. And thank you all for being here today and giving me this opportunity to share about reading and writing poetry in adult education. James told you about me. I do hope that you all are introducing yourselves in our chat box. Just a heads up, I'm not able, while I'm sharing my screen, I can't see what you're putting there. I'll try to save time at the end to double check if there are any questions in the Q&A box. And I hope you're letting us know where you're joining us from, what your role in adult ed is. And I would like to know if you're a fan of poetry or not. I imagine many of you are, and you might not be here otherwise, but I also understand a lot of people aren't. They're poet skeptics, let's call some folks that. It is my opinion, however, that poems are like people. You're not going to like everyone you meet. My hope is that today in this webinar, you'll be introduced to some poems that you may not have met before and poems that you might like. And my hope is that someday, if you have not yet, that you will meet a poem that you can love. Before I share our objectives for this webinar today, I do want to make a public service announcement. Those of you who've registered for this webinar will be getting tomorrow your certificate of participation and 6 documents that I have shared with COABE in order to share them with you. You do not need to take notes. Every bullet point on each of my slides is in those documents. There's several handouts that will be in those documents that you will receive via email. My hope is that you can sit back and listen. So here are our objectives for today, for this presentation. I would like to identify the benefits of reading and writing poetry. Why would we do it in our adult ed classrooms? I want to consider the elements of a poem. What is it that makes a poem a poem? I want to discuss the kinds of poems to teach that will have broad appeal with our adults. I will be suggesting strategies to approach poems and recommend many, many resources to locate poems. And again, all of the links, all of the titles for the poems, for the lesson plans, all the links will be in the documents that will be emailed to you tomorrow. And then finally, I want to talk about how to turn poems into practice for a high school equivalency test. And this last objective is where we're going to start. Just exactly how can we prepare students to pass high school equivalency tests with poetry? So the answer for me is how we prepare them for high school equivalency tests by reading anything, whether it's a news article or a chapter from a book or a blog post. While we read in our classrooms, we ask the kinds of questions they'll be asked on high school equivalency tests. And in order to facilitate that process, one of the documents that will be shared with you is this one I created many years ago for my students. It's entitled More Than 20 Questions to Ask While Reading. I wanted my students, while we're reading together in class, and I'm punctuating our reading by asking questions along the way, I wanted them to have in front of them just exactly what the question is asking. So these questions, reading comprehension, language, critical thinking and language skills. There is a brief explanation and reminder of what they are so that in the class, when I ask the question, the way it will be asked on the GED, excuse me, that's the flavor of high school equivalency test I teach here in North Texas, high school equivalency tests, they'll come to recognize what the question is asking them to figure out. Since this document is small, here on this screen, I have 1-2 word phrases that capture the questions. And we can ask all of these questions about anything we read in class together, including poems. And at this point, instead of telling you about it, I'd love just to show you and share with you our first poem today. It's entitled Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden. I will be playing a recording of the poet, Robert Hayden, reciting his own poem. After we listen to this, I will put the text to the poem on the screen and I'll give you a chance to look at it. And while you're looking at the text of the poem, I'll ask the kinds of questions, many of them culled from that list of more than 20 questions. I'll share with you the kinds of questions I might ask my students in the classroom. So here we have Robert Hayden reciting Those Winter Sundays.
Here is a poem that comes directly out of my boyhood in Detroit, and it's called Those Winter Sundays. Sundays, too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then, with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made bank fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the coals splintering breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the coal, and polish my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices?
So that was Robert Hayden reciting his poem, Those Winter Sundays. Here's the text. Hold on, folks. Here's the text. Whoops. Here's the text for you to take a look at. And let me ask you the kinds of questions I would ask my students, starting with noticing the title. and asking, what does the title tell us? Those winter Sundays. Sundays, of course, is plural. So we're not just talking about one Sunday, but we're talking about many Sundays, winter Sundays. Those is also plural. It's not this Sunday or that Sunday. It's not these Sundays, but those back then over there. There's some distance between those winter Sundays. And the title tells us all of that. I would ask, what is the tone or attitude of the poet toward those winter Sundays in the past? What is the mood or emotional climate created in the poem? What is the theme of the poem? What is the poet seeming to say about life or human nature without coming right out and directly saying it? I would ask, what does the poem make you feel? Does it make you think of your relationship with your father? And if you have children, does it make you think of those relationships? What was the emotional climate in your childhood home? What word or phrase would you use to describe the feelings in that home? All of these, of course, could be writing prompts and encourage students to write on these questions. You can ask, what conclusions could we draw about the character of the father, revealed by his actions as recalled by his son? What inferences could we make about why the father polished his son's good shoes as well on those winter Sundays? And you can always look at vocabulary and context. Look at the meaning of chronic, indifferently, austere, and offices in this context. One of the handouts you'll be getting, one of the documents that COA will email to you is that list of questions in case you would want to explore this poem with your students. But again, it just serves as a reminder that we can read anything. We can read a poem and ask the kinds of questions they'll get on the GED. So why teach adults to read and write poetry? I'm going to pause here before I share a list, a bulleted bullet point list with you, and just share a personal story. During the pandemic, we've all just lived through and are still living through a pandemic. I was invited by my 29-year-old son, who lives in New Jersey, to join a prayer meditation circle out of New York with him. And I did. I did not know anyone in the circle except my son. And I attended for more than 2 years now, once, twice, sometimes more times a week, sometimes every day of the week, during vacation and during, well, when I had COVID, quite frankly, I attended every day that week. And I want to share with you the practice in that circle is to spend 10 minutes at the beginning in silence, focusing on our breathing, to do it again at the end. But in the middle of the circle, there's a facilitator who will read a poem. And then it's opened up and we would share what's on our hearts, on our minds, joys, concerns, and thoughts about the poem. And so I experienced firsthand the sustaining nature of poetry with a bunch of strangers, with a circle of people that I did not know. And I have gotten to know them and they have become incredibly dear to me. And so this encounter with poetry during the pandemic encouraged me to want to do more research and to find more ways to introduce poetry into my classroom, my circle of adult students, to enable them to have this kind of adventure, this kind of encounter with poetry. And hence I developed this presentation and I'm excited to be able to share it with you. I will at this point let my bullet points do the talking. So reading and writing poetry promotes. So why teach adults to read and write poetry? Because it promotes reading comprehension, critical thinking skills, creative expression. Poetry promotes appreciation for the power words can convey. It promotes self-reflection, self-awareness, self-compassion. Poetry promotes a sense of being known and understood by another, first and foremost by a poet, but also by anyone you read and discuss poetry with, your classmates. Sharing and learning from different perspectives can be promoted by reading poetry. Empathy for others' thoughts, feelings, and experiences. and they're different from our own. We can experience a sense of belonging to a community as we read and discuss poetry and share poetry we've written. It can promote curious inquiry and acceptance of uncertainty, because the fact of the matter is, when we read a poem, it's different than talking to a poet in a one-on-one conversation. We're reading their words. We can wonder, we can guess, but we may not always know what they're talking about. And we can accept the fact that we don't know everything. We can accept uncertainty. And the last bullet point I'd like to share about what I believe poetry promotes: learning and growth is a lifelong quest. So I did talk about poetry before the pandemic. I've made a more concerted effort with this presentation for COABE to do the research for myself so that I'd be able to do it even more in the classroom. But in the past, when I've introduced poetry in the classroom, I've often started with this question: what makes a poem a poem? And there are many elements of a poem. The sounds, the repetition of consonants and vowels, the accents and syllables, the rhythm and rhyme. If your students are like mine, they usually focus first and foremost on the rhyme. But of course, not all poems rhyme. And that's a lesson in and of itself for our students to realize that not all poems need to rhyme. The visual element of a poem, how it's arranged on a page, the position and length of words, lines and stanzas, the punctuation, the capitalization, if they're different fonts, all of that can contribute to the visual effect that a poem has. The senses, how our senses can be tickled and excited by word pictures created by imagery and figurative language, such as similes, metaphors, and personification. All of that, of course, imagery can appear in prose writing as well as poems, but poems are especially noted for their richness in such word pictures. And ideas, the ideas that are expressed in a poem, the denotation or definition of a word, the connotation or the emotional positive or negative sense that you get from a word. The connection of the words and phrases and clauses and how these develop throughout the poem. All of these four elements that I've highlighted, if you're interested, you might want to check out this lesson plan from poets.org called Noticing Poetry. I will tell you that this is a 2-hour lesson. It was fascinating to me. It helped me to pay more attention to what I'm noticing in poetry as I read it myself and as I introduce it to my students. This particular lesson plan at poets.org focuses on a 2-line poem, In a Station of the Metro by Ezra Pound. And students can spend 2 hours focusing on all these elements. Now, we're not English teachers. We are a high school equivalency teacher, so we teach English, reading and writing, but we're not going to spend a whole unit in our classrooms on poetry, I don't imagine. For our purposes, trying to help our students prepare to pass HSE tests, this is probably where we'll camp out: the meanings of the words and the lines in a poem, the explicit statements and the implications, which can lead us to making inferences, to drawing conclusions, and personal applications. The sixth and final, and I'm just going to show my bias, my personal favorite, most important to me aspect or element of a poem has to do with feelings. And I will share with you the mic drop moment when I was talking about what makes a poem with my adult students a number of years ago, prior to the pandemic. There was a 17-year-old young man in the class, and I happened to know he wrote poetry. And so I made a point of bringing poetry into the classroom when he was there. As we were talking about what makes a poem, he hadn't said anything. And when I turned to him and I said, so what do you think? What makes a poem? He said, I think it has more to do with how it makes you feel. And I do agree. The kinds of questions you can ask about poems that you'll see on a high school equivalency test. What's the tone of the poet? What's the mood of the poem? And then we can explore what's the emotional response of the reader as well. So What kinds of poems should we teach? I would say poems that have broad appeal. And since, as I noted at the very beginning, we're all different, there are different kinds of poems that will appeal to different people. There still are a number of things I am on the lookout for when I'm looking for a poem that I think my adult students will appreciate. I look for poems that will connect us to our emotions and humanity. Poems that remind us of personal experiences. Poems that give insight into others' experiences. Poems that illuminate diversity and multiculturalism. I look for poems that resonate with positive values. Poems that reveal reality and recognize hardship and suffering, because the suffering is real, but at one and the same time, I look for poems that will explore possibilities and offer relief and hope. And finally, I look for poems that will surprise and delight us. So at this point, and again, let me remind you, each of these bullet points is in the notes that you will be receiving from COABE in your inbox if you've registered for this webinar tomorrow. So you don't need to be writing all of this down. You'll see this again if you're interested in it. I want to share a poem, Gate A4 by Naomi Shihab Nye. For me, this is an example of a poem that checks off all the boxes. It meets all of the things I'm looking for a poem that has broad appeal. It is 4 minutes, but it's worth it to me. And I'll ask you if you agree. After we've listened to Naomi Shihab Nye read Gate A4. Now I'm going to skip the introduction. I found this at poets.org. Let me move ahead and we'll start at the beginning.
Wandering around the Albuquerque airport terminal, after learning my flight had been delayed 4 hours, I heard an announcement. If anyone in the vicinity of Gate A4 understands any Arabic, please come to the gate immediately. Well, one pauses these days. Gate A4 was my own gate. I went there. An older woman in full traditional Palestinian embroidered dress, just like my grandma wore, was crumpled to the floor, wailing. "Help," said the flight agent. "Talk to her. What is her problem? We told her the flight was going to be late, and she did this." I stooped to put my arm around the woman and spoke haltingly. "Shu dawa, shu bidak habibti, ستنى شوي, min fadlik, shu bتسوي?" The minute she heard any words she knew, however poorly used, she stopped crying. She thought the flight had been canceled entirely. She needed to be in El Paso for major medical treatment the next day. I said, "No, we're fine. You'll get there, just late. Who is picking you up? Let's call him." We called her son. I spoke with him in English. I told him I would stay with his mother till we got on the plane. She talked to him. Then we called her other sons, just for the fun of it. Then we called my dad, and he and she spoke for a while in Arabic and found out, of course they had 10 shared friends. Then I thought, just for the heck of it, why not call some Palestinian poets I know and let them chat with her? This all took up 2 hours. She was laughing a lot by then, telling of her life, patting my knee, answering questions. She had pulled a sack of homemade mamoul cookies, little powdered sugar crumbly mounds stuffed with dates and nuts, from her bag, and was offering them to all the women at the gate. To my amazement, not a single woman declined one. It was like a sacrament. The traveler from Argentina, the mom from California, the lovely woman from Laredo. We were all covered with the same powdered sugar and smiling. There's no better cookie. And then the airline broke out free apple juice from huge coolers, and 2 little girls from our flight ran around serving it, and they were covered with powdered sugar too. And I noticed my new best friend, by now we were holding hands, had a potted plant poking out of her bag, some medicinal thing with green furry leaves. Such an old country, traveling tradition. Always carry a plant. Always stay rooted to somewhere. And I looked around that gate of late and weary ones and thought, this is the world I want to live in, the shared world. Not a single person in that gate, once the crying of confusion stopped, seemed apprehensive about any other person. They took the cookies. I wanted to hug all those other women too. This can still happen anywhere. Not everything is lost.
So let me ask, how did that make you feel? If you want to share in the chat box, I can't read it now, but I'll be delighted. I will read it later. How did it make you feel? For me, this checks off all the boxes. I will add at this point that poems may trigger strong emotions. And since I don't imagine any of us are counselors and our classes certainly aren't meant to be therapy sessions, we do want to proceed with some care and some caution and sensitivity when we select poems and lead discussions about them. But I think the rewards are worth the care and the sensitivity. So at this point, I'd like to highlight some strategies that we can use to approach poetry. The first strategy I'd like to talk about is focusing on the title, the lines, or themes of a poem. I've selected a poem entitled Mistake that I would like to share with you. The text to the poem is on the screen. I will let you know that the recording of this particular poem is fainter than the others. It may be a little difficult for you to hear, but as one of my students, he was 70 at the time. And when I discussed this again, prior to the pandemic, when we discussed this poem in my classroom, he said he could listen to her talk all day. So I'd love for you to hear the poet recite her own poem. I hope you can hear it. And this is Mistake by Heather Crystal.
Mistake. For years, I have seen dead animals on the highway and grieved for them, only to realize they are not dead animals. They are t-shirts or bits of blown tire. And I have found myself with this excess of grief I have made, with no object to let it spill over. And I have not known where to put it or keep it. And then today I thought, I know, I can give it to you.
So Mistake by Heather Crystal, I think it's a fine example of how we can focus on the title. It helps us to focus on our common humanity because we all have made mistakes. It helps us to focus on shared emotions. The line that jumped out at me is where she says, I have found myself with this excess of grief. And of course, grief is an emotion we all have experienced. The theme of this poem, if you go down to the end of the poem, it's a short poem. She says, I have not known where to put it. What is it? The pronouns referring back to grief, I believe. I've not known where to put it or keep it. And then today I thought, I know, I can give it to you. And we can ask our students what you is referring to. Do you think you is referring to the poem or to the reader of the poem? We do get a hint from the poet what her theme is. At poets.org, which is where I discovered this poem, when they send out a poem a day, you can get it in your inbox. They also include something the poet has written about this poem. And what Heather Crystal wrote about this poem, she said, what if a poem were a place where you could put an idea, and were you to do so, the idea would no longer remain present in your own body. And that motivated me to want to try to replicate that experience for my students. I believe this may have been the first poem I had students write a poem in response to. And when I give a homework assignment, write a poem, because it's so personal, it's so private, especially, I told my students, please write a poem entitled Mistake. And I told them, this is a homework assignment. I do want you to do it, but you do not have to show me. You don't have to let me read it. And you certainly don't have to let me read it and share it with the class. But I want you to write it for yourself. Do the homework for yourself, not for me. Think about your mistakes, reflect on it, put it into words, put it into a poem. And 4 of my students did this. I think I had 6 or 7 that day. And the majority of them did write a poem in response about mistakes. And they not only wanted me to read it, they wanted me to read it to the class. They wrote about, one student wrote about smoking cigarettes. Another student wrote about dealing drugs. Another student wrote about dropping out of school. Another student wrote about being rejected by her mother. And another student who was in her early 60s at the time wrote about hooking up with an older man. And the devastating last line of that poem that she wrote was, I was 13 years old. So these students wrote these poems, wanted me to share them with the class. And as you can imagine, when something so personal is shared, so intimate, it really was a sacred experience to read and share these poems with each other. And Mistake paved the way for that. This poem paved the way for that. The next strategy I'd like to share with you is connect a poem to a quote, a paragraph, or a chapter in a book. When I read paragraphs or chapters in books, I'm on the lookout for poems that I can connect to the lesson. The one I'd like to highlight now is a quote from Frederick Douglass. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Frederick Douglass, of course, escaped from slavery in 1838. Before the Civil War, decades before the Civil War, he became an abolitionist leader. And this quote comes from a speech that he gave in 1857, which actually was 12 years after the end of the Civil War, talking about if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Talked about this quote with my students. Have you struggled? Have your struggles led to progress? We then followed up that discussion with some selections from commonlit.org. This is a wonderful resource, not only for thousands of reading selections, but also for hundreds of poems. We read this excerpt from the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, excerpts from chapters 1 and 7, where he talks about how he struggled to teach himself to read and write at a time when it was illegal to teach slaves to read and write. Commonlit.org, if you're not familiar with it, they have accompanying questions. We then read this poem, Learning to Read, by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. It was written in 1872, so 7 years after the Civil War was over. She herself was not a slave. She was the daughter of free Blacks, but this poem was about the struggle that freed Blacks encountered as they were trying to learn to read and write. We next read another passage from the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass at commonlit.org. This chapter was on his escape from slavery. And we followed up that selection with another famous poem by Maya Angelou, also at commonlit.org, Still I Rise. And so this poet, this civil rights activist, in this poem, she's talking about overcoming struggles in her life and the struggles that African Americans have had to overcome in history. And so after reading these selections, after reading these poems, we went back to our quote from Frederick Douglass: if there is no struggle, there is no progress. And again, I gave a homework assignment. I said, you're required to do this. I want you to do this. I want you to think about it, put your thoughts and feelings into words, into a poem. You don't have to show me, you don't have to share it with me. I just want you to do it for you, do the homework for you. And after I assigned this, only one student did the assignment. Late at night, she texted this to me, and with her permission, I'm going to share it with you. I will let you know that she is an English language learner, and this was her response to this quote from Frederick Douglass. She said, As I've been in pain, I sit and think, what more can I handle? I've been shredded in pieces, but still standing. Am I meant for this? What can I learn from this? How do I deserve this? I always thought about this. After the rain is a rainbow. After every tear I met, get twice a laugh back. I might not be sure who know this world. At the end, I know that it was meant to be every inch of it all as I strong, because without it all, it wouldn't be me talking now, myself, what I had become. And have I been rewarded? Indeed, I have, as I am blessed and beyond loved and happy. After bitter, there's a sweet. It's bittersweet that I live, I enjoy, I am thankful. So that was the one poem that one student shared with me following the homework assignment. She wanted me to read it out loud to the class. I did. Their response was so heartwarming. They talked about their favorite lines. They recognized what courage it took to have the poem read out loud in the class. It was just so affirming of the young woman who had written and shared the poem with us. So I gave the assignment again for the following week and asked students if they would to write a poem. Didn't have to share it with me and with us, but I did want them to write it. 4 more students followed through. Actually, I take that back. 3 students followed through, but didn't want to share it with the class. So I asked them, how did it make you feel just writing it? We didn't read it, but how did it make you feel writing it? And their responses were so poetic. One student said he felt a sense of relief writing it. Another student, an older woman, said she felt like she was opening up a safe inside. And then a third student said his feelings were spider webbing out, which is a gorgeous, vivid image of describing how the feelings as he wrote his poem again, which we did not get to read, as they were spider webbing out. Then the following week, more students wrote poems and they did want to share them with the class. And so I read poems out loud about a grandfather's death, about another student's struggle with depression. And I would like to read the first line from a poem. One of my young students, she's 17 years old. She's already had 1 major organ transplant and she's due for another. And her poem began, I feel like my soul is trapped in a pincushion suit. My soul is being held hostage in my own body. So yet again, as people were sharing their thoughts, their feelings, and as they were daring to share it with the class responded with appreciation and with affirmation. And it was a beauty to behold. It was a sight to behold. Another strategy I'll share with you, commemorate dates in history plus current events and experiences. I'm going to highlight this resource. You'll be getting the link, Poetry in the Classroom Calendar. This also comes from poets.org. And for each month of the school year, they have themes for the month. They have dates in history, particularly birth dates, birth years of poets, and then links to poems and to lesson plans and other resources that you can use if you want to use poetry in the classroom. This calendar can help. Another strategy I'd like to suggest, consider the lyrics of and listen to songs. Of course, they are poetic. There is a specific lesson plan I would love to bring to your attention, also at poets.org, called Word Karaoke. And in this lesson plan, students are asked, what's a favorite line from a song? The whole group, and dozens and dozens of lines are put up on the board. Then they break into small groups with a partner and choose one of the lines. It may not be their favorite line, but choose one of the lines to spark a poem written with the partner and then later shared. It's a really fun lesson plan. I hope you'll have a chance to check out. So what resources can we use to locate poems? I have mentioned multiple times now poets.org. In addition to providing a poem a day that you can get in your inbox, Poets.org provides a Teach This Poem lesson plan, one a week, and they've been doing this for about 5 years now. So there are 100-ish lesson plans for various poems. I'm going to share one of the poems, and I will not share the lesson plan, but I will tell you each of their lesson plans. Their introduction to the poem is a resource from some other genre, some other subject. So they might share a song, they might share a work of art, share something from another genre or subject that can be a jumping off point to the poem. And they encourage students with a partner first and then with the whole group to notice and discuss that resource first, and then with a partner and then with the group, notice and discuss the poem. So the poem we're going to take a look at is Disclosure by Kamisha L. Jones. I got this from Teach This Poem at poets.org. I want to share with you the resource that they wanted students to focus on first. It's this comic entitled, If You Want to Say Thank You, Don't Say Sorry, by Yao Xiao. If you want to say thank you, don't say sorry. If you want to say thank you for your patience, don't say, sorry, I'm always late. If you want to say thank you for understanding me, don't say, sorry, I'm not making a lot of sense. If you want to say thank you for spending time with me, don't say, sorry, I'm kind of a drag. If you want to say thank you for listening, don't say, sorry, I'm just rambling. If you want to say thank you for appreciating me, don't say, sorry, I take up so much space. If you want to say thank you for having hope in me this whole time, don't say, sorry, I'm such a disappointment. Appreciate the others for what they have already done, whether they know it or not. Don't apologize for simply existing, because it is not wrong. So after students would focus and discuss this cartoon, this comic, then they would listen to, first read silently, then listen to Disclosure by Kamisha L. Jones. The text is on the screen, and I will go ahead and play it for you now.
Disclosure by Kamisha L. Jones. I'm sorry. Could you repeat that? I'm hard of hearing. To the cashier, to the receptionist, to the insistent man asking directions on the street. I'm sorry. I'm hard of hearing. Could you repeat that? At the business meeting, in the writing workshop, on the phone to make a doctor's appointment. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm hard for the hearing. Repeat, repeat. Hello, my name is Sorry. To full rooms of strangers, I'm hard to hear. I vomit apologies everywhere. They fly on bat wings towards whatever sound beckons. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I am so sorry. And repeating and not hearing. Dear, again, I regret to inform you, I am here.
So that was Disclosure by Kamisha L. Jones, and an excellent lesson plan among many lesson plans at Teach This Poem at poets.org. So in addition to a poem a day and teach This Poem at poets.org, there are 3 other sites I'm highlighting that can provide you with poems in your inbox every day at poetryfoundation.org, Poetry Daily at poems.com, at the Writer's Almanac. Another resource I'd like to point out to you, the Library of Congress has a lot of poems, and Poetry 180 was a project of Billy Collins when he was Poet Laureate of the United States in, I believe it was 2001 to 2003. And he collected 180 poems that he suggested that they be read or heard in high schools across the country. And I created, with this particular website, I created a poetry treasure hunt. This is one of the documents I'll be saving with you, where I've sent my students, my adult students, to the site and asked them to look at all the titles, and actually not all the titles, but a section of the titles, until they find a title that sounds interesting to them. And I want them to anticipate, guess, what do you think the poem's going to be about? Then read the poem. And if you like the poem, I'd like you to focus on one line that you like and come back and tell us what's the title, what's the line, and what do you like about the poem? And that line in particular, is it because of something about yourself? Is it about something about what it reveals about the world? Or is it just because of how it's written and the language that the poet uses? And so I send them out to find a poem that they like, and then come back and share them. And this was a really fun activity to do with my students. Again, not everyone follows through, but enough people did that it was certainly worthwhile. In addition to this resource, I've already talked about looking for poems at commonlit.org. I want to mention facinghistory.org. And searching for poems there. They've got about 100. Facing History and Ourselves is the website. Their mission is to use lessons of history to challenge teachers and their students to stand up to bigotry and hate. I wanted to highlight a lesson plan here. Teaching Amanda Gorman's New Days Lyric. Again, it comes from facinghistory.com. And you may be familiar with her. She was the young woman who wrote the poem that was read at Biden's inauguration. And at the end of 2021, she wrote a poem that she released on social media. And it's beautiful. It's a powerful poem. I do have, I'm going to play 30 seconds. We're getting close to the end here. So I'm just going to let you see the first 30 seconds of it, and I'll cut it short. I will tell you the lesson plan at facinghistory.com encourages students to write lines to insert into the poem. And it's really very powerful. Let's just listen to a few seconds of this.
May this be the day we come together. Mourning, we come to mend. Withered, we come to weather. Torn, we come to tend. Battered, we come to better. Tethered by this year of yearning, we are learning that though we weren't ready for this, we have been readied by it. We steadily vow that no matter how we are weighed down, we must always pave a way forward.
Sadly, I'm going to stop us there. The whole poem is worth listening to, and encouraging students with a partner to write a line to insert in between. I've not done this lesson plan yet, but I loved it and wanted to bring it to your attention. So other resources, books by Kenneth Koch. These are 50 years old. This is how I first fell in love with poetry 20 years ago when I was homeschooling my kids. I used these books to instruct me on how to teach children to use classic poems as a model, as a mentor for writing their own poems. I highly recommend them. I also recommend What No One Ever Tells You. These are selected works from Underground Writing. This is a creative writing program in Washington State where they work with incarcerated and migrant recovery and other at-risk communities and take poetry into workshops that they present to them. And this is an anthology of their writings. They're very accessible. Our students could really relate to them. I'll also highlight Teach Living Poets by Lindsay Illick and Melissa Alter-Smith. I heard Melissa Alter-Smith present at a conference, and I haven't read the book cover to cover, but I've noticed enough in there that I am confident that you'll find things in there too you might be interested in doing with your students. So don't forget YouTube. Most of the poems that I have been able to share video recordings of have come from YouTube today. Sadly, I'm not going to share this one with you, Broken English by Rupi Kaur. She's of Indian descent. Her parents emigrated to Canada from India when she was young. It's a very powerful poem. My students, particularly my English language learners, really appreciated this poem. I'm going to give you a heads up. One of the reasons I'm not playing it now is I just discovered, since I sent all the information out to COABE, that this is now a private link, but you can search her name And this title for this poem, Broken English, and you can find it online. And there's actually another place where you can listen to her present it, and it's worth the effort. Last thing I want to share with you is a lesson plan that I developed based on this book by Carl Upchurch, actually just based on an excerpt from one chapter from the book. I've not included the excerpt because I don't feel at liberty to. I haven't gotten permission to share a portion of this book, but I will summarize the part of the chapter that I read out loud with my students. I will share a quote from the book. So Carl Upchurch was in prison for 2 months, bored, hadn't noticed that there was a thin book under one table leg of the single table that was in his cell. He'd been there for 2 months before he noticed it. When he noticed it, he pulled it out, hoping it would be something he'd want to read. It was a book of Shakespeare's sonnets, and he didn't want to read it. He put it back under the table leg, but he continued to be bored. A couple days later, he pulled the book back out and started reading the sonnets, and he did not connect with them right away. He had to read them again and again and again, had to ask for a dictionary to decipher the meaning of many of the words. But after reading them dozens of times, he found that he could resonate with William Shakespeare. Here's a quote from this chapter. Carl Upchurch writes, "I had almost always been contemptuous of intellect. That book of sonnets didn't just change my opinion, it quite literally changed my mind. I discovered the magic of learning, the thrill of going from not knowing to knowing. By struggling to understand Shakespeare, I came to see that ideas have a beauty all their own, beyond even the beauty of the words that frame them. The words, too, fascinated me. I couldn't just run over the ones I didn't know, ignoring them. I had to look them up, learn to live with them." One of the handouts you'll be receiving via email are questions that I developed with this chapter in mind. And if you look at the questions when you get the handout, it may prompt you to want to check out the chapter as well. So Carl Upchurch's favorite sonnet by William Shakespeare was Sonnet 29. We won't take the time to listen to this now, but I did have my students translate it from old-fashioned English to plain English, today's modern language. And that was a really fun exercise. They did it in small groups, and they did it with a dictionary in their hand, just like Carl Upchurch did. I do want to, let's listen to the beginning of Native Tongue by Micah Bournay, a spoken word poet. It's not long. I don't think we'll get all the way through it, but let's listen to a part of it as a part of an extension for this lesson plan.
According to ShakespeareOnline.com, the English language owes a great debt to Shakespeare. He invented over 1,700 of our common words by changing nouns into verbs, changing verbs into adjectives, connecting words never before used together, adding prefixes and suffixes, and devising words wholly original. If I could, I'd spit this in whatever mother tongue was ripped from our mother's lips. But the closest I got to that is hip-hop, is black talk, is improper, non-proper, unproper, uneducated, un-educated, unassimilated me talk, we talk, our talk, make y'all wish y'all know I'm talking about talk, make y'all ask your black friend talk, make y'all run to urbandictionary.com talk, that one thing, that something that belongs to us. That us you try to demonize, envy, copy, despise. That us you try to categorize, stereotype, try to shame our broken English you wish you could understand, but you can't never get it because we stay fly, we stay fresh, we stay changed, we stay everyday new way to say we never believed your lies, we never spoke your tongue, we been uneducated, educated, unassimilated, and if you ever want to know what we talking about, maybe you need to unlearn a thing or two. Who says our vernacular ain't classical? Who says rap lyricists are any less than Shakespearean? Shakespeare, a man who turned nouns into verbs and invented 1,700 words. That's funny. When we break the rules, we're called ignorant. When we invent words, they're called slang. The way we talk is improper, non-proper, unproper, uneducated, educated, unassimilated. We ain't never been dumb. We break English like chains. This is our native tongue.
Well, I just simply couldn't cut him off. His battle cry is fight evil with poetry. So this brings us close to our conclusion. To summarize, why teach poetry to adults? Reading poems can teach critical and creative thinking skills. Discussing poems can teach listening to and learning from others. Writing poems can teach us about our own thoughts and feelings. And sharing poems can create confidence and community. Wanted to focus at the end, not on the objectives of this presentation, but the outcomes I'm looking for in my classroom, and I trust you are as well, and how I believe poetry can help us reach these outcomes to encourage and empower students, to enable students to express themselves and listen to others, to promote community and a sense of belonging, and to create classroom climates conducive to learning and growth, and to assist students in persisting and achieving their goals, and yes, to pass high school equivalency tests. You do have a homework assignment. I'm not going to talk about it now, but you can take a look at it if you like. You're doing it for you. You're not doing it for me. It will be in the documents that'll be sent your way. I want to read one last quote. This is from Kurt Vonnegut. The arts are not a way to make a living. They are a very human way of making life more bearable. Practicing an art, no matter how well or badly, is a way to make your soul grow, for heaven's sake. Sing in the shower, dance to the radio, tell stories, write a poem to a friend, even a lousy poem. Do it as well as you possibly can. You will get an enormous reward. You will have created something. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'll be able to glance. I think we've got a minute left. I can glance at the Q&A questions in the box. If anyone has questions for me, let me see. I see 3. Let me see. So thank you. I appreciate, oh my goodness, thank you. Prakash from Chicago. Thank you for sharing your emotions, sharing your satisfaction. So I appreciate that very much. Y'all, thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you to COABE. Thank you to Brainchild for sponsoring it. And here's my hope, that you will indeed do as Kurt Vonnegut encourages us, that you will create something, and that you and your students will be rewarded by your efforts in your classroom. So thank you all for being here today. And thank you, James.
Carrie, that was a wonderful presentation. It was by far one of the better webinars I've participated in. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much. I also want to thank Brainchild and Andy again for their sponsorship and their support. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I'm sure I can see everybody sees the poll that I launched and the wonderful results that are coming back, not surprisingly. So if you're still on, if you could just take a second to fill that out, let us know what you thought about today's webinar. And after you're done with that, again, as Carrie mentioned, this webinar will be posted to coabe.org within about 24 hours of its conclusion today. So you can go back, tell your friends, and watch it again and refer it to others, because it really was something special. So thank you very much. Thank you again, Carrie. Thank you for everybody who joined us today. I hope everybody has a great rest of the day and a wonderful rest of the week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you all. Bye-bye. Thanks, James.